The screams started long before anyone believed they were real. According to archived maintenance logs from the winter of 1923, staff at the Pennhurst State School recorded persistent nocturnal disturbances in the women's infirmary wing. The reports were brief, clinical, easy to dismiss. But one note, written in hurried ink across the bottom of a daily report, stood apart. Patient 47 does not sound alone. Pennhurst State School, located in rural Pennsylvania, opened in 1908 as an institution for the mentally and physically disabled. Its official mission was care and rehabilitation. But by the early 1920s, overcrowding had turned its stone corridors into something colder, something harsher. Rows of iron beds filled rooms built for half their number. Windows were barred. Heat was inconsistent. Silence was enforced. Witnesses later reported that nights inside the women's infirmary felt heavier than elsewhere on the grounds. Nurses described the air as stale and suffocating, even when windows were cracked. Patients who were usually calm would sit upright at the same hour each night, between 2:15 and 2:30 a.m., their eyes fixed toward the far corner of the room, the corner where patient 47's bed had been placed. Her name was Margaret Holbrook. She was 27 years old when she was admitted in November of 1922. Church records from St. Michael's Parish in Westchester describe her as reserved, intelligent, and deeply religious. She had worked as a seamstress and lived with her widowed father until his sudden death from pneumonia. After his passing, neighbors claimed Margaret changed. She began complaining of sleeplessness. Then whispers. She told her priest that someone was speaking to her at night, not outside her window, but from inside the walls. The attending physician diagnosed her with acute melancholia complicated by religious fixation. Within weeks, she was committed to Pennhurst by court order. The admission documents make no mention of violence. No record of self-harm. Only persistent auditory hallucinations with spiritual themes. For the first month, Margaret was described as cooperative. Quiet. She prayed frequently, often kneeling beside her bed long after lights out. Nurses initially found comfort in her calm demeanor. In a ward filled with screaming fits and unpredictable behavior, Margaret's stillness seemed harmless. But stillness can be deceptive. In late December, Nurse Eleanor Briggs filed the first unusual report. She wrote that Margaret had begun refusing to lie in her bed. Instead, she would stand beside it, staring down at the mattress as though something rested there. When ordered to lie down, she complied, but only after tracing the shape of the mattress with trembling fingers. When asked what she was looking for, Margaret whispered, "It moves when you don't." Staff assumed paranoia. Then came the scratches. On January 4th, 1923, attendants noticed thin red marks along Margaret's forearms. She insisted she had not caused them. Her fingernails were kept short. The marks were evenly spaced, almost symmetrical. A physician suggested dermatitis from anxiety. Ointment was prescribed. That night, 3 patients in adjacent beds began screaming at the same moment. Nurse Briggs later testified that the screams were not random. They were synchronized, as if triggered by a single event. When the gas lamps were lit, Margaret was sitting upright, her head tilted sharply to one side. Her mouth was open, but no sound emerged. The 3 other women pointed toward her bed. "She's talking again," one cried. But Margaret's lips were still. Over the next week, the disturbances grew more structured. According to infirmary logs, each night at precisely 2:17 a.m., Margaret would begin murmuring in a low tone. The language was unrecognizable. Not Latin, not German, not anything the staff could place. One orderly described it as wet and layered, as though more than one voice moved through the same throat. Physicians increased her sedatives. The drugs had no visible effect. By mid-January, even skeptical staff began avoiding her section of the ward after dark. A maintenance worker named Thomas Greeley later claimed that pipes in the ceiling above Margaret's bed would rattle violently during her episodes, though the rest of the building remained silent. He checked the heating system repeatedly. No mechanical fault was found. On January 19th, the infirmary's superintendent, Dr. Harold Winthrop, documented a private interview with Margaret. His notes remain preserved in microfilm archives. "She presents oriented to time and place," he wrote. "Speech coherent when not in nocturnal state. When questioned regarding nightly disturbances," patient states, "it stands behind you when you write." Dr. Winthrop reported feeling sudden vertigo during the interview. He ended the session early. Within days, Margaret's physical condition began deteriorating. She refused food. Not violently. Not dramatically. She simply turned her head away and whispered, "It feeds differently." Weight loss followed. Dark circles formed beneath her eyes. Yet her pulse remained steady. Temperature normal. Then something happened that shifted the tone of the institution entirely. On January 27th, a snowstorm cut power to several outbuildings. Emergency lanterns were distributed. The infirmary was dim, shadows stretching long across the floors. At 2:17 a.m., Margaret began her usual murmuring. But this time, the gas lamps nearest her bed extinguished simultaneously. Multiple witnesses confirmed it. Nurse Briggs swore she had trimmed the wicks herself an hour prior.
There was no draft.
No broken line. In the darkness, patients began screaming again. An attendant rushed forward with a lantern. The light fell across Margaret's bed. She was not in it. The iron restraints remained buckled. The window above her bed was locked from the inside. For 37 seconds, by official report, Margaret Holbrook could not be located within the infirmary. Then the murmuring resumed. The sound came from beneath the bed. 2 orderlies dragged the frame aside. Margaret lay flat on her back, pressed against the stone floor, though there was barely enough clearance for her body. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest. Her eyes were open. The murmuring continued, but her lips were sealed shut. Witnesses later disagreed on what disturbed them more, how she fit into that narrow space, or the fact that frost had formed along the underside of the bed frame directly above her. After that night, the administration contacted clergy. Officially, the request was for spiritual reassurance. The institution did not use the word exorcism, but church correspondence from February 1923 indicates that Father Edwin Mallory of St. Agnes Parish was summoned for evaluation. Father Mallory arrived on February 3rd. He was 46 years old, known for skepticism, practical. He had previously assisted in cases of alleged possession that were later diagnosed as hysteria or epilepsy. According to his own written statement, he entered Pennhurst expecting another tragic mind overtaken by grief. His first meeting with Margaret occurred in the afternoon, under full daylight. She appeared frail but composed. When he introduced himself, she smiled faintly. "I wondered when you'd come," she said. Father Mallory noted no hostility, no dramatic reaction to holy symbols. He spoke with her for nearly an hour about her childhood, her father's death, her prayers. Then he asked about the voice. Margaret's gaze shifted, not toward him, but slightly over his left shoulder. "It doesn't like when you ask directly," she whispered. Father Mallory later admitted that he felt an abrupt temperature drop in the room at that exact moment. He dismissed it as draft from the corridor. He requested to observe her during the nocturnal episodes. Permission was granted. On February 5th, Father Mallory sat beside Margaret's bed shortly before 2 a.m. Nurse Briggs and 2 orderlies remained near the door. The ward was silent except for distant coughing and the ticking of a wall clock. At 2:16 a.m., Margaret's breathing changed. It slowed, deepened. At 2:17, her eyes opened. They did not focus. The murmuring began again. Father Mallory described it in his later report. The sound did not originate solely from her throat. It carried resonance inconsistent with her weakened condition. "I placed my hand near her mouth and felt minimal breath." He began reciting the Lord's Prayer softly. The murmuring grew louder. One orderly later claimed that Margaret's abdomen appeared to contract sharply with each phrase of the prayer, as though something inside resisted. Father Mallory raised his voice. Margaret's head turned toward him with unnatural precision, too smooth, too controlled. Then she spoke clearly. "You are late." The voice was not layered this time. It was singular.
Come.
Masculine in tone. Nurse Briggs dropped the lantern. Darkness swallowed the ward for several seconds before the flame was restored. Margaret was sitting upright now, though no one had seen her move. Father Mallory asked her name. She smiled. I have had many. He reached for the small crucifix hanging at his neck. Margaret's expression shifted, not to fear, but to something like irritation. The iron bed frame beneath her began to vibrate. Not violently.
Subtly.
A tremor that traveled into the stone floor. The other patients began whispering in unison from their beds. Father Mallory continued praying. Margaret leaned forward until her face was inches from his. Her eyes were no longer tracking together. And then, in a tone barely above a whisper, she said something that would remain absent from official reports, but preserved in Father Mallory's private journal. She said my mother's name. He had not spoken it aloud in over 20 years. The temperature in the ward plummeted. Frost crept along the inside of the window glass despite the functioning radiators. One of the orderlies attempted to restrain Margaret. He later stated that her skin felt wrong. Not cold, not warm, but resistant, as if pressing against packed earth. Father Mallory began the rite of minor exorcism. Margaret's body arched backward over the iron headboard in a way that should have broken her spine.
But no bone snapped.
No cry of pain escaped her. Only that same low, layered murmur, now filling the entire ward. And then the gas lamps extinguished again. In total darkness, Father Mallory heard something move across the stone floor. Not footsteps. Not fabric. Something slower. Deliberate. When the lantern was relit, Margaret was no longer on the bed. She stood at the far corner of the room, the corner all the other patients had stared at for weeks. Her back faced them. Her head was tilted toward the wall, as if listening. And from within the stone itself, faint but unmistakable, came a second voice answering her. The second voice did not echo. It did not bounce off stone or carry through the ward like a trick of acoustics. It pressed outward from the wall itself, low and steady, as if something within the foundation had been waiting for permission to speak. Nurse Briggs would later insist the sound resembled breath passing through damp soil. One of the orderlies described it as a man speaking from underwater. Father Mallory wrote only one line about it in his private journal. It answered her. Margaret remained motionless in the corner, her forehead nearly touching the stone. Her shoulders rose and fell in slow, synchronized rhythm with the voice in the wall. No one moved. Even the other patients, who had moments earlier been whispering, had gone silent. Father Mallory stepped forward first. He commanded her to return to the bed. Her body did not respond, but her head turned slightly, just enough for one eye to become visible in profile. The pupil was dilated so wide that the iris seemed to disappear. You built it wrong, she said quietly. The second voice inside the wall grew stronger. Not louder, but closer. At that moment, a crack shot across the plaster above Margaret's head. It began as a hairline fracture, then widened with a sharp, splitting sound. Dust fell onto her shoulders, but she did not flinch. One orderly rushed forward and grabbed her arm. He later testified that the wall felt warm, not the surface. The air around it warm and humid. The crack deepened, forming a vertical line almost 3 feet long. Father Mallory pressed the crucifix against Margaret's back and began reciting the rite again, this time louder, with authority. Margaret convulsed once, violently, but did not fall. The voice in the wall stopped. Not gradually. Instantly. Silence filled the ward. Margaret collapsed. When attendants lifted her, her body felt limp and weightless, as though whatever tension had held her upright had vanished. She was returned to the bed. The crack in the wall remained, thin and jagged, but no further sound emerged from it that night. The incident was not formally documented in the institution's public records. Instead, Dr. Winthrop filed a short report stating that structural stress from winter temperature variance caused superficial plaster damage. He also recommended that Father Mallory discontinue ritual intervention, citing potential psychological reinforcement of the patient's delusions. Father Mallory refused. According to church correspondence dated February 8, 1923, he requested authorization for a full solemn exorcism. The bishop responded cautiously. Pennhurst was a state-run institution. Public acknowledgement of possession could provoke scandal. The bishop permitted continued spiritual evaluation, but withheld formal approval for the rite. The nights grew worse. Margaret stopped speaking entirely during daylight hours. She would sit upright in bed, eyes fixed toward the cracked wall. When fed, she chewed mechanically but swallowed only after long pauses, as if awaiting instruction. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the murmuring returned. But now it came from two directions. Margaret's lips moved again, shaping unfamiliar syllables. The crack in the wall, though unmoving, emitted the same low resonance heard before. Staff reported vibrations beneath their feet, subtle tremors traveling through the stone floor. On February 11th, another patient in the ward, a 17-year-old named Lillian Mercer, began repeating phrases in her sleep. "You built it wrong." She had never spoken to Margaret. When questioned the next morning, Lillian remembered nothing. That same day, maintenance workers were ordered to open the cracked section of wall to assess potential structural damage. The plaster was chipped away carefully. Beneath it lay the original stone foundation, uneven, darkened with age. But there was something else. Carved directly into one of the stones, hidden beneath decades of plaster, were shallow markings. Not decorative. Not accidental. Symbols. Rough lines intersecting in patterns unfamiliar to the workers. They appeared old, far older than the building itself. The stone had likely been repurposed from an earlier structure when Pennhurst was constructed. Dr. Winthrop ordered the symbols covered immediately. But Father Mallory had already seen them. He copied their shape into his journal that night. In a later letter to the bishop, he wrote, "These markings are not random. They predate this institution. I suspect the ground itself carries a history not recorded in state documents." Historical records reveal that before Pennhurst was built, the land had housed a smaller almshouse during the late 1800s. Before that, there are sparse references to a settlement that collapsed under unclear circumstances. Official archives provide little detail, but local oral accounts, preserved in county folklore collections, describe voices in the quarry long before the asylum stood. On February 14th, Father Mallory initiated the exorcism without formal diocesan sanction. He chose the infirmary ward itself. Margaret was restrained to the iron bed, not violently, but securely. A small table held holy water, oil, and a worn Roman ritual book. Nurse Briggs remained present despite visible fear. Dr. Winthrop observed from the doorway, arms folded tightly. The rite began at 1:45 a.m. Margaret lay still at first, eyes closed, breathing shallow. At 2:10, her pulse accelerated sharply. At 2:16, the air pressure in the room shifted. Several witnesses described a sensation of fullness in their ears, like descending in altitude. At 2:17, every patient in the ward opened her eyes at once. Not slowly. Instantly. Margaret's restraints tightened as her body strained against them. The bed frame groaned under sudden force. Father Mallory spoke firmly, invoking the authority of the church. Margaret's eyes snapped open. They were no longer unfocused. They were fixed directly on him. "You have no ground here," she said. Her voice overlapped itself again, tones layered slightly out of sync. Father Mallory sprinkled holy water across her forehead. The reaction was immediate. Her skin reddened, not burned, not blistered, but flushed deeply, as though blood rushed violently beneath the surface. She screamed, but the sound fractured halfway through, splitting into two distinct pitches. Simultaneously, the crack in the wall widened. Plaster fell in chunks to the floor. The stone beneath began to vibrate visibly. Dust filled the air. Dr. Winthrop stepped backward into the corridor. Father Mallory continued. Margaret began reciting something, not resisting the prayer, but speaking over it. The language was the same as before, thick and rhythmic. But this time, the other patients in the ward began repeating it word for word. Even Lillian. Even those heavily sedated. Their voices blended into a single, unified chant. The building trembled. A loud crack split the ceiling above Margaret's bed. Fine debris rained down. The lantern light flickered violently. Father Mallory pressed the crucifix to Margaret's chest and commanded the entity to name itself. Her mouth opened wider than seemed physically possible. No blood. No grotesque distortion. Just a stretch of jaw that defied anatomy. The answer did not come from her throat. It came from the wall. A deep, resonant syllable rolled through the room. Not shouted. Not whispered. Simply spoken with weight. The other patients fell silent immediately. Margaret's body lifted several inches from the mattress. Not violently. Not thrown.
Raised.
The restraints strained, but did not break. Nurse Briggs began praying aloud, her voice shaking. Father Mallory repeated the command. The stone in the wall fractured fully this time, splitting down the center. A hollow space lay behind it, narrow, vertical, extending downward beyond sight. From within that cavity, warm air flowed outward. And something else. A smell. Not decay, not rot, but damp earth after heavy rain. Margaret's body twisted midair, her head turning toward the opening in the wall. Her expression shifted from rage to something disturbingly close to relief. "It remembers," she said softly. The cavity in the wall seemed deeper than the building's dimensions allowed. The lantern light failed to reach its end. Witnesses later insisted they saw movement inside it. Not a figure, not a face, but shifting darkness against darkness. Father Mallory began the final invocation, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Margaret screamed again, and this time the sound was purely human. Agonized. Terrified. The chanting from the other beds resumed, but now it was distorted, misaligned, as if their voices lagged behind reality by a fraction of a second. The floor cracked. A thin fissure shot outward from the base of the wall, traveling beneath Margaret's bed and across the stone tiles. The lantern extinguished. In total darkness, Father Mallory continued speaking. He felt the crucifix grow hot in his palm. Margaret's screams shifted into sobbing, then into silence. When light was restored seconds later, her body had fallen back onto the mattress. The restraints remained intact. The crack in the wall had stopped widening, but the cavity remained open. The warm air no longer flowed. Margaret's chest rose and fell weakly. Her eyes were closed. Her face looked older, drawn tight against bone. Father Mallory approached cautiously. He called her name. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then her eyes opened.
Clear.
Focused. And utterly empty.
She did not speak.
She did not move. Behind her, inside the narrow hollow of the wall, something shifted again. Not loudly. Not violently. Just enough to suggest that whatever had been forced back had not been removed. Only displaced. And as Father Mallory stepped closer to examine the opening, a small fragment of stone broke free from the cavity's edge and fell to the floor, revealing, etched deeper within the darkness, more symbols carved into stone that had never been meant to see light.